Edward Ashby.
Thanks, Damir. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the invitation here. It's a wonderful opportunity for me. I've actually written several books before, but they're all very deeply technical textbooks that are probably good if you have insomnia. They're good bedtime reading to cure your insomnia. But this one was my first attempt at something a little bit different, and it was a bit of a crazy project, actually. Today I'd like to, reflect for you some of the insights from this book, and with a particular focus on artificial intelligence, which is, of course, one very hot aspect of technology development today. I think probably most of you have heard from both of these people, Vladimir Putin and Elon Musk. So Putin, quite famously, last September, in September 2017, at the beginning of the school year in Russia, delivered a traditional address that the president of Russia delivers to all the school children across Russia. And in that address, he said, whoever becomes leader in artificial intelligence will become ruler of the world. A bit of a scary statement from someone like him. Elon Musk, who is a serial entrepreneur, has started several companies, including SpaceX and Tesla, and is a bit of a futurist himself that normally I think has a very optimistic view of the future, calls AI an existential threat to humanity, but he urges government regulation before it's too late. And one of the things that I'd like to do today is to emphasize the question of how do we regulate something that we don't understand? So I think the focus of my work and the focus of my book is on trying to understand what's actually happening today with technology development. I'm not trying to make any predictions, okay? I'm not going to stand up here and talk about, the singularity when AI runs off without us and leaves us behind and things like that. In fact, one of the key arguments that I'm going to make, one of the consequences of the argument is that prediction is actually very difficult in this case. And so I'm not going to attempt to do prediction. Instead, I'm going to focus on what is happening really very much as an evolutionary process. And, if we could ask the question, will artificial intelligence exceed human intelligence? This is a really difficult question because we can't really answer this question without getting a firm handle on what intelligence is. And I'm not qualified to do that myself. And I'm not sure that any of us really is. But we can ask a really much simpler question that I think gives us much better insight into what's going on. The question I would suggest is, will machines exceed humans? And the answer to that question is really easy. Yes, they already have. In many dimensions, right? Machines have exceeded humans in all kinds of dimensions, going back quite far in history. I think what is scaring people today is that machines are starting to show signs of being able to exceed humans in cognitive functions, which is a relatively new development. Okay, that's a naturally scary thing, but this should be viewed within the context of the overall evolution of technology and the relationship that humans have and have had for a long time with technology. So my focus is really on trying to understand this part of the evolution. I'm not going to try to understand the future. I'm not really going to try to understand the history that much, but just what's happening today. Okay? So this book, as I mentioned, was kind of a crazy project, and it has a crazy title that the publisher tried to talk me out of. The publisher hated the title. They couldn't see themselves selling a book called Plato and the Nerd. And I actually picked the publisher to be MIT Press because I thought that would be a good publisher for a nerdy book, but it's not really meant to be a nerdy book, but in any case, they didn't get the joke. And they really wanted me to change the title, but the title, I went back and forth with them, and they suggested many alternatives, but none of them really worked as well, for me at least. So I'd like to just try to explain a little bit about the title, and I think it'll help you give you a little bit of the philosophy of what I'm going to be talking about. So If we look at the problem of artificial intelligence, one way to approach the problem is, in fact, to say we could use technology to help us understand a natural phenomenon, which is intelligence. Intelligence is a natural phenomenon. It's very well represented in this room, okay? And we are all creatures of nature. That would be one approach to AI. But there's a very different approach to AI, which is that we're actually trying to engineer mechanisms and processes that never existed before in nature, okay? These are very different perspectives, and to some degree, the title here is trying to put these two different perspectives in opposition with one another. So the picture here is from a painting by Raphael that hangs in the Vatican. It's a close-up of the painting. The painting is called The School of Athens, and these two guys are right in the center of the painting, and on the left is Plato, and on the right is Plato's student Aristotle. And Plato is kind of gesturing to the heavens, and Aristotle is sort of gesturing to the earth, okay? And Plato and Aristotle had rather different perspectives on what truth was and what it meant to do intellectual inquiry. So in Plato's view, truths and facts about the world exist independent of humans. They're just truths out there in some Platonic heaven waiting to be discovered. And the goal of intellectual inquiry is to discover those truths. Okay, so discovery becomes the main objective. And in some sense, in this Platonic view, the discoverer is not that important, right? Alfred North Whitehead said, you know, a science that doesn't forget its heroes is doomed, or something to that effect, right? The idea is that the discoverer is not that important because the truths and facts exist independent of humans. Aristotle had a different perspective, and he said that really, actually, no, we construct truths and facts through observation of the physical world. He was sort of the original empiricist. He said that, you know, it's through looking at the properties of the physical world around us, observing those properties of the physical world, that facts and truths emerge through our understanding of the patterns there. I could have called the book Plato and Aristotle, but then no one would have bought it because they would have thought it was a philosophy book, and it's not really. And the nerd here is really representing kind of the little bit more the bottom-up Aristotelian view. It's the quirky, creative force in our culture that is creating facts and truths that never before existed. So if you look at AI from this perspective, the ultimate goal of AI in the Platonic view is to make the machines do what humans do, because that's the epitome of intelligence in nature. And we've discovered how to do that if we've succeeded. The nerd's perspective, however, is to make machines do things we never dreamed of before and that don't exist in nature. Okay? These are two different views, and there are consequences to choosing these two different views. So the subtitle of my book is more explicit. It talks about the creative partnership of humans and technology, and this is alluding to the fact that this really is a partnership, and that technology and humans are actually evolving together. Technology changes us, and we change technology in very much of a feedback loop. Okay? So that's really a major theme of my book. Now, if you look at this, you know, Plato versus the nerd dichotomy, there's another way to look at it in very concrete terms, which is science and engineering. I think, you know, in sort of a traditional view of science, it's about discovery of facts and truths about the world. And I think many scientists are deeply Platonic people. They think that these secrets of the universe are out there in a Platonic heaven just waiting for us to discover them, right? And engineers don't tend to think that way. They're more about creating things that didn't exist before, right? It's not about discovering things that are pre-existing in some hidden form. So let's look a little more closely at this science versus engineering context. So in my book, I wrote quite a bit about this project, the LIGO project. LIGO stands for Laser Interferometry Gravitational Observatory. And the goal of this project was to essentially build a kind of telescope that would detect gravitational waves, which are distortions of space-time that are caused by gravitational fluxes. And in particular, Einstein had predicted the existence of gravitational waves. And if you run the numbers using Einstein's formula, you can figure out that it takes really massive gravitational phenomena to produce observable gravitational waves. In particular, they had decided that you would have to have quite massive black holes colliding somewhere in the universe before you would see a measurable gravitational wave. So they set out to build an instrument that would measure these gravitational waves. And this is one of two instruments that they built. This one is in Louisiana. And if you look closely at the picture, you can see that there are two tubes emerging at right angles from this building in the center. And the tubes are about 4 kilometers long. And the goal of the instrument is to very precisely measure the distance between the ends of the tubes. So you've got a 4-kilometer distance. It turns out that if you have a gravitational wave passing through, that distance will change ever so slightly. In fact, it will change by a tiny fraction of the diameter of a proton. This is an extremely small change in a 4-kilometer distance. They built an instrument that would measure that change. That instrument is a marvelous piece of engineering. It's using techniques that have been known since the 1970s. It's laser interferometry, which dates back to the invention of the laser, together with some extremely clever mechanical engineering, temperature compensation, noise cancellation, but basically all essentially known techniques, and it's a marvelous piece of engineering. Now, when I wrote the book, I didn't know this was going to happen, but just last fall in 2017, Rainer Weiss, Barry Barish, and Kip Thorne, who are 3 of the 1,048 authors on the key paper announcing the first detection of gravitational waves. They're 3 of 1,048. They got the Nobel Prize in Physics. And I'd like to read for you the citation for the Nobel Prize. It says, "For decisive contributions to the LIGO detector and the observation of gravitational waves." For decisive contributions to the LIGO detector. To my knowledge, this is the first time for a Nobel Prize in Physics to explicitly go to an engineering effort. It wasn't for discovery of laser interferometry. It wasn't for discovery of gravitational waves. In a sense, it was a confirmation of Einstein's theory, but nobody doubted Einstein's prediction of gravitational waves. So, but that is mentioned in the citation, right? It was for the observation of gravitational waves. But really, the engineering got acknowledged here. So that's an interesting phenomenon, right? Because it's more about this nerd side and less about this Platonic side than is traditional. Now, let me look at a contrasting Nobel Prize. So these 3 guys, Bardeen, Brattain, and Shockley, got the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956, and their citation read, "For the discovery of the transistor effect." That's what their Nobel Prize citation says. Now, to my knowledge, no one has ever found a transistor in nature. So they discovered something that didn't exist. That's interesting. But actually, even more interesting is if you go back and look at the history, there was a patent issued in 1930 for the 1925 invention of the field effect transistor. You can download this patent, you can read it. It is a field effect transistor. The transistor was invented 20 years before it was discovered, 23 years before it was discovered. Now, you don't get patents for discoveries, and you don't get Nobel Prizes for inventions. But this invention occurred 23 years before the discovery. So this tells us really that there's a kind of a complicated relationship between this issue of discovering Platonic truths versus creating things that never before existed. And a major part of my book is about exploring that tension between these worlds. So one of the key insights that I got while I was working on this book, and this is an insight that has actually profoundly changed my technical life. Everything that I do in my technical research today is now shaped by this insight. So it has to do with the use of models. Now, scientists and engineers both use models intensively. It's all about models. And in science, the value of a model lies in how well the behavior matches some physical system. The goal of a scientist is to construct models that are good descriptions of some phenomenon in nature. But that's not really what engineers do, okay? For an engineer, the value of a physical system lies in how well it behaves like the model. The most dramatic instance of this that I know of is in chip design, electronic circuits, where everything is done in models all the way to the last stage of when you tape out a chip fabrication. It costs millions of dollars to make a chip, many, many millions of dollars to make a chip. So you don't prototype some physical. Pretty much the whole design process is using models. You come out in the end of that design process with a description of a logic diagram that specifies the logic that the circuit should implement, and then it's kind of up to the silicon to match that model. If I give you a piece of silicon that doesn't behave like that model, that piece of silicon is junk. There's nothing wrong with the model, it's the silicon that's junk. Scientists can't do that, right? A scientist can't say that if my model doesn't match the physical world is junk. But an engineer can do that, and we do it all the time, in fact. We try to make the physical world conform with our models as much as making the models correspond with the physical world. Now, this split is, in a way, a tremendous oversimplification, because every engineer uses models both ways, and every scientist uses models both ways. But in my experience, most of the people, when they're using models, don't know which way they're using it. They don't realize that they're using a model in a scientific way versus an engineering way, or vice versa. And when I've gone back and looked at a lot of the work that I've done over my career and realized that some of the most profound mistakes I made were from misunderstanding how I was using models along the way, okay? So another way to say this is, a scientist will ask, can I make a model for this thing? And an engineer asks, can I make a thing for this model? An even more interesting way to look at it is a scientist tries to shrink the number of relevant models. These are the models that you need to explain the physical world, and having fewer is better than having more. But an engineer tries to grow the number of relevant models, which are the models for which we can build faithful physical realizations. So if you look at AI from that perspective, the engineering perspective on AI is far scarier than the scientific one. Humans, duplicating human intelligence is already dangerous enough. We know humans are extremely dangerous, so if we manage to make machines that smart, yes, we're in trouble. But in the engineering view, we can do much worse than that, or better than that, right? So we should try to understand what's actually going on and figure out how to steer the process so that we actually do better than that and not worse than that. So addressing this existential question, so this is an image from the movie The Matrix, which hopefully most of you have seen, but this is, one of many sort of dystopian movies where the machines have taken over and the humans have been sidelined. And I think that, in that movie, it's an essential question whether, are we actually growing models so as to create what amounts to really a new life form. That's what it is. The machines in the Matrix are a new life form. They've taken over the planet and sidelined the historical life forms. Okay? So is that what we're doing? Are we growing models to create a new life form on the planet, one that will potentially eventually replace us? That's a possibility. Well, if we look at what happens with computers today, there's actually a lot of computing systems that do have a little bit of the flavor of a life form. They sit in some environment, they react to stimulus from the environment. These date back to the 1970s when we had, time-sharing systems. These were computers that were constantly running some program. They would react to stimulus from the environment, a login request from somewhere, and they would, give you reactions to that. And of course, If you look at each decade, we've seen a growing number of these, and now we're using these kinds of living computing systems all the time. Right? Every time you go to Google search is something that doesn't sleep, it doesn't die and get reborn. It's 24/7 reacting to stimulus from its environment. How much is that actually like a living thing? Well, in a scary respect, it's actually quite a lot like a living thing. It's not biological, but that's about the only difference that it has. It has almost all of the other elements of living things. Here's a few of them due to, this particular diagram is due to a biologist, Chris Packard, who identified these 7 characteristics that define a living thing. Responding to stimulus from the environment. Yeah, Google search does that. Cellular. In other words, it has structure and composition. Oh, of course, Google search has cells. We call them servers. Those servers are actually themselves composed of subcells, microprocessors. Okay. Metabolism. Energy from chemical reactions. Yeah. Right? What keeps the Google servers going? Well, mostly natural gas-driven power plants, which you can consider to be part of the digestive system of that computer. It's being fed fossil fuels, which are ultimately just an indirect way of converting sunlight into energy. Humans also are fed by mostly indirect ways of converting sunlight into energy. We don't eat fossil fuels so much, but we eat plants, which are, in fact, the result of converting sunlight into usable forms of energy for us. So arguably, these machines also have a form of metabolism. Homeostasis, so this is a property where living things will control their local environment. And in fact, the Google servers have that. They have computer-controlled air conditioning systems that regulate the temperature within the data center, okay, in much the way that the human body regulates the temperature within itself. They grow and develop. In the Google servers, cells die, so servers fail every once in a while. They get pulled out of the rack. Another server gets stuck into the rack. It starts up and starts functioning within this bigger system. The number of servers can grow. The amount of software can grow. The system doesn't get shut down each time to create a new system. In fact, it is just growing, okay, while it's living. So that has the character of a living thing. It's able to reproduce, right? In fact, Google search is arguably a mutant of some of the search engines like Alta Vista and so forth that preceded it. So these systems can be copied and reinstantiated somewhere else. So their reproduction is possible. So far, the machines are requiring humans to help them reproduce. But then again, even living things have a hard time reproducing by themselves without the help of other living things. So humans cannot reproduce without the help of other living things. Think about it. In order for humans to reproduce, we have to keep a woman alive for 9 months. Actually, at least 12 years plus 9 months, right? Until they have reached a certain level of maturity, right? How do you keep a woman alive? You have to feed her. What is that feeding? Well, it's leveraging other living things. In fact, it's within an ecosystem. Without other living things, humans are unable to reproduce. Now, that's not quite as direct as the mechanisms by which the machines are reproducing today, where humans are much more directly involved in this reproduction process. But that's starting to change already, right? I mean, we have a lot of mechanized production procedures for making those servers and for deploying software on them. And many of those mechanized production mechanisms are very much controlled by the computers. So they're getting more autonomy in their reproductive mechanisms. So the most interesting one to me is this last one, the 7th one, heredity. What's that about? Well, does software, when it reproduces, inherit from previous software? Absolutely. Every software engineer knows that almost no programmer starts with a blank slate, right? What you do is you take a piece of code from here and you combine it with a piece of code from there, and you write a few scripts to stitch them together, and you've got a new program. That's a form of heredity, and in fact, it's a form of heredity that provides a mechanism for some rather rapid mutation. So these systems really they have a lot of the character of living things, and so this analogy can start to become a lot stronger than you might think initially. We can think of these software systems as living while they're operating and evolving when they're reproducing with the help of software engineers who then provide the mechanisms for mutation for them to co-evolve with us. And in fact, in my book, I talk very much about this coevolution as being a very Darwinian coevolution. I've written a lot of software in my life, most of which has died. So I've created mutant programs from previous programs, and I deployed them once or twice, so they lived for a short time, and then they died and were forgotten. And nobody saw them again, and their DNA didn't make its way into other programs. In fact, this is what happens with most programs. But a few of them actually survive and then get copied more. And the ones that survive are often surviving for very accidental reasons that have a lot to do with their ability to procreate more than anything else. They're not necessarily technologically superior. They just find themselves in a situation where they get copied a lot. Okay? And that leads to a very Darwinian kind of evolution of these systems. So what about the coevolution part of the story? The humans are actually changing along with the technology. Very much so. I mean, if you have kids, you know this, right? Their interaction through screens is not what I was doing when I was a kid. It was really quite different. And it's shaping their brains in some ways that is kind of scary. I mean, there's these recent publicized studies about increased rates of depression among kids correlated with their use of smartphones. So, in fact, human culture is changing right along with the technology. And this idea of culture evolving in a Darwinian sense is not a new idea. This idea is due to Richard Dawkins, who first wrote about it in this book called The Selfish Gene. And in this book, he coined the term memes, which were meant to sound like genes. And a meme is a unit of idea that replicates and propagates in culture. Okay? It can be as simple as words in a language. It can be as complex as the protocols by which we shake hands with people. Shaking hands, that's a meme. And these things propagate in culture, and they survive in a very Darwinian way and evolve in a very Darwinian way, according to Dawkins. Our use of technology is also that way. In fact, if you think about so I have two daughters that are 6 years apart. One of them is 22 years old and one of them is 16. They use technology already quite differently from one another, just in a 6-year span. You know, the 16-year-old is Snapchat is her main thing, and you know she's interacting with people through mechanisms where she's creating all these little ad hoc videos, some of them quite astonishingly beautiful, short little videos constructed from snippets of her life, and she uses those to communicate with the world. Whereas my 22-year-old is using Facebook, and they just in that 6-year period, their interaction with culture is using significantly, noticeably different mechanisms. So the culture is evolving along with the technology. So this particular idea, I first heard about it, this coevolution of technology, from this book, George Dyson's Turing's Cathedral. And I want to read you a little bit about this because towards the end of this book, this is a wonderful book, by the way, if you're interested in the history of computing. It's mostly a history book, and it's mostly about John von Neumann. And it's a wonderful way to get insight into how the whole world of computing emerged starting in the 1940s and 1950s. But later in the book, Dyson starts to become more speculative about what's happening in the future, and he talks about a visit that he made to Google, where he learned about how the Google servers work. He describes Google's million-plus servers as a collective metazoan organism. Metazoan means multicellular. And he points out that the companies and individuals who nurture the servers are ever more richly rewarded in return. Interesting way to look at it, right? The employees of Google are nurturing the servers, and the servers are rewarding them with financial success. Okay? That's a coevolutionary, a symbiotic coevolution, in fact. Right? And if you think about it, you know, in the world of startups, if you build a startup around software, if your software fails to propagate, your company dies. Right? That's a symbiosis. Very much a symbiosis. And a company is a cultural meme. Okay? So this idea, George Dyson develops really nicely, and he says, again, quoting from his book, he said at one point, unemployment is pandemic among those not working on behalf of the machines. So the first time I rode an Uber, I had this really weird experience of seeing this driver sitting in the car who was completely under the command of this machine on his dashboard. But it wasn't this machine on his dashboard commanding him. It was a server in the cloud commanding him, right? It was the server in the cloud that matched him up to me to pick me up at a particular location, told him exactly where to go to pick me up, then told him where to drive me to. And I realized that this driver was simply the sensor system and the low-level control system for this big machine. Okay? His existence depended entirely on the fact that the machine hadn't yet figured out how to do its own sensing and its own actuation of the steering wheel and brakes and pedals, so it needed a human to do those low-level functions in order for the big machine to be operating. Compare that to the taxi drivers who are trying to go it alone, and they fall into this situation, at least in the US, where unemployment is pandemic among those not working on behalf of the machines. Another quote from his book, he says, the big computer is doing everything in its power to make life as comfortable as possible for its human symbionts. Interesting take. So in my book, just quoting from my own book, I say, well, all right, if computers and software form organisms, then they depend on us for their procreation. We provide the husbandry and we serve as midwives. So husbandry is what farmers do when they take, a strong animal and mate it with another strong animal, right? They're trying to create another strong animal. That's what we're doing with software. We're doing husbandry, and we're midwifing the birth of the software. And in exchange, we depend on them to manage our systems of finance, commerce, and transportation. But more interestingly, the machines make the humans more effective at the very husbandry that spreads the software species. If you're writing software today, I do this, my productivity writing software is orders of magnitude better than it was 15 years ago. I can write software much faster. Why? Because whenever I'm puzzling about how to do something, I just ask Google. And Google finds the page that tells me, here's how you do that in Java. And here's a discussion of its strengths. Oh, and by the way, here's an even better way. Okay? Remarkable, right? The machines are actually helping me create the next generation of these machines. So the software survives and evolves only if the company survives and evolves, and vice versa. So there's a really fancy term for what is emerging here. It's an obligate endosymbiosis. So this is a term that comes from biology, and this person, Lynn Margulis, was one of the key popularizers at least. You can trace the idea back further than her, but she really contributed an enormous amount to this idea of obligate endosymbiosis. And one of the things that biologists have come to understand is that the cells that make up our own organism probably emerged as a symbiotic relationship between distinct cells. So the nucleus in the cell has a different heredity than the cell itself, and the nucleus got absorbed into the cell when they decided to, instead of just eat one another, to cooperate. Now, they didn't decide to do that. It was an evolutionary process that made it happen. Same with the mitochondria inside the cell, which comes from a different historical root. So this endosymbiosis idea is when you have two distinct living species that merge into a completely codependent living thing. And if you think about it, we really are very dependent on the machines. Try to imagine what would happen if you wake up tomorrow and all of the computers on the planet are down. Okay? What would happen? Let me point out, all the money you have is what's in your pocket as paper money. That's it. That's all you've got. Okay? If we were to shut down all the computers tomorrow, billions of people would die. Okay? I guarantee it. If that isn't a symbiosis, I don't know what is. Right? We are very, very dependent on these machines, and of course they're very dependent on us. So this symbiotic coevolution is reflected, this idea is reflected right on the cover of my book in a drawing that I made. And again, quoting from my book, I say, you know, are we playing God, creating a new life form in our own image? This is the issue of trying to make AIs replicate human intelligence. Is that what we're trying to do? Create a new species in our own image? Or are we being played by a Darwinian evolution of a symbiotic new species? Are humans the purveyors of the noisy channel of mutation, facilitating sex between software beings by recombining and mutating programs into new ones? I just raised the question. So the humans are most definitely evolving along with the technology. Again, quoting from George Dyson's book, he says, Facebook defines who we are, Amazon defines what we want, and Google defines what we think. He goes a step further, and he says it's not just the memes among humans that are evolving, but he's starting to see signs of biological evolution in humans also being affected by the machines. And he raises the question, are we using digital computers to sequence, store, and better replicate our own genetic code, thereby optimizing human beings? Or are the digital computers optimizing our genetic code and our way of thinking so that we can better assist in replicating them? I think it's a thought-provoking question, and one that we should not dismiss, because one property of evolutionary processes is that there is no purpose to that process. There is no purpose. It just happens, okay? And if you understand how it happens, that can have a big effect on your understanding of what's going on. Now, if you think of this as an evolutionary process, it's very clear that it's occurring very rapidly right now. There's no doubt about that. If this analogy with living things is valid, they're clearly changing really, really fast. Evolution has happened fast in the past. If you look at a period of time in the history of the world called the Cambrian explosion, so this was more than 500 million years ago, over a very short period of time of about 20 million years. 20 million years, that's nothing in biological evolution. So over a period of about 20 million years, the Earth went from having essentially no multicellular organisms to having about twice as many multicellular species as it has today. Okay, in a very short period of time by evolutionary terms. Why did that happen? So there's this evolutionary biologist named Andrew Parker who wrote a book in 2003 called In the Blink of an Eye. And he postulated a thesis that is now called the light switch thesis, which is that what happened about 500 million years ago is that biology started to figure out how to sense light. So probably accidentally, through just some chemical stuff that happened, these organisms started to be able to sense light. And once they were able to sense light, they could change the way they interacted with their environment. Instead of just sitting there and whenever a nutrient went by, they gobbled it up, they would instead be able to start to pursue the nutrient because they were able to detect that there was something that looked kind of tasty. But of course, once they were able to detect something that looked kind of tasty, then anything that didn't develop the ability to detect them would be killed off pretty quickly. And so the prey had to evolve also to develop the ability to see. And this took off in a rapid feedback loop where the killing of predation and prey accelerated evolution, and very rapidly these very complex organisms with very well evolved abilities to see emerged. In fact, in that 20 million year period, eyes very much like what we have today were already in evidence over a very short period of time, an incredibly complex piece of machinery to have evolved in a very short period of time. So if you think about this from the perspective of what happens with AI, well, you know, one of the things we're doing with the computers today is that they're no longer just information technology machines. We're connecting them to the physical world. We're putting them in control of cars. We're giving them cameras and auditory equipment to be able to sense the physical world and control the physical world. Are we giving them eyes? This is an interesting question. I mean, this whole field of cyber-physical systems and the Internet of Things is all about endowing those computers that used to be just living within an information world. All they could do was process bits. Now they actually are able to control and sense the physical world. That's a pretty transformational thing. So, related to this question, if we are designing these systems, are we really in control? Another book by Richard Dawkins that I really recommend reading is The Blind Watchmaker. And in this book, Richard Dawkins argues that evolution is capable of far more complex and sophisticated design than any top-down design process could ever create. For most of my career as an engineer, I thought I was designing systems in a very top-down fashion, that I was in control of what I was designing, and that what came out of my design processes was entirely my invention and my creation. I now know that's not true. Everything I have created has been hugely influenced and, in fact, in many ways controlled by the things that other engineers created before me. The designers of the programming languages that I use shaped my thought and affected my designs. And in fact, arguably, you could take any reasonably complex system. Amazon is a really complex ecosystem right now that involves all kinds of moving parts, many different players interacting with it. I don't believe that anyone could have ever sat down and designed that system. It evolved. It was not designed. The humans provided the mutation forces, and there is a large role for creativity in that process. But it's a mistake to think of that system as having been designed by humans. So I started to look at the various projects that I was involved in. So here was one of the projects that this one ended last year. Huge effort. The TerraSwarm Research Center, which I directed for 5 years, was a $27 million project, mainly focused in the Internet of Things space, involved 9 universities across the US, working in all kinds of things, machine learning down to sensor systems. And I started to look at what this project was doing from this perspective of this evolutionary perspective of the technology. And here's a list of a few of the projects that we were working on. And I just want to give you a sense of how I now understand these things. So one of the projects was this one that we called the Global Data Plane. And this was about having a more sophisticated way to connect sensing devices and actuating devices that were spread out geographically. Really, it's about evolving a better nervous system for these living software systems. Here was another project that we called the Urban Heartbeat. And this one was really about creating connected sensors that could be put anywhere. One of my favorite ones is this one right here, this plug load meter. So this is a little circuit board just about this big that has 3 holes in it, and it doesn't have any battery in it or anything. You just put the plug through the holes and stick it in the wall, and then it harvests power from, I mean, there's plenty of power obviously on that plug, right? So it's got plenty of power. But what it does is it measures the electrical consumption of the device that you've just plugged into the wall, and it communicates that by radio to a server. This is creating eyes for the machines. They're able to see things that they couldn't see before. Okay? Every one of these sensing projects is about creating eyes for the machines. One of my own projects was very much about how do you enable software engineers to take a big chunk of sophisticated software from here and combine it with a big chunk of sophisticated software from there to get a new kind of service or function. Each of these boxes here is backed by a fairly sophisticated thing. So, for example, these boxes right here are backed by the whole ROS world, robotic operating system, if you know anything about that. this software infrastructure was giving us a way to combine ROS-based systems with systems that had never heard of ROS. This is really about faster reproduction, mutation, and evolution. It facilitates husbandry, right, where we can take pieces of software from one place and combine them with another. If you work on security and privacy, we had a big effort in this project on security and privacy. It's about creating better immune systems. As with any complex system, pathologies can emerge. It can be debatable whether something is a pathology or is actually just a normal part of the evolution, right? It might just be a change in the organism. But some of them are fairly clearly pathologies. So computer viruses, for example, which can disrupt our whole financial network, for example. These are things that we would definitely agree are pathologies and that we have to protect against. And so any effort that you have working in the area of security and privacy is about creating better immune systems for these machines. Another project that we had as part of TerraSwarm was focused on localization. So this was an effort to endow the machines with the ability to tell where they are in space. This is a form of what biologists call proprioception, right? The ability that the human body has to sense where I am and where my limbs are relative to my body. The scariest one was this project that we called Of Swarms and Humans, and this was about creating direct connections between humans and the machines. One of the crazier projects, sub-projects in here was pursuing something that they called neural dust, which are tiny devices that would communicate ultrasonically that you could implant deeply inside the brain of an animal, and it would be able to communicate ultrasonically with devices on the surface of the brain. So this may be about stronger symbiosis. Another one of the projects that we had in this effort was about converting data into information. So the observation was simply that, well, the physical world is giving us vast amounts of data. What do you do with that? How do you turn that into something actionable? That was the focus of this project. Arguably, what's going on here is dreaming. Dreaming? So this is, again, a quote from Dyson's book. He said, "The behavior of a search engine when not actively conducting a search resembles the activity of a dreaming brain. Associations made while awake are retraced and reinforced, while memories gathered while awake are replicated and moved around." That is, in fact, the servers spend most of their time indexing and organizing information, not responding to queries. And it's that indexing and organizing of information that enables the instant response that you get from Google. Much the same as what happens in the human brain. I mean, if you ask me a question about something I know, I don't go search through vast amounts of my historical memories. No, I have the answer for you right away, in part because my brain has indexed and organized that information in some way that we don't completely understand, okay? But it enables that kind of instant replay. And I think biologists are fairly sure that sleeping and dreaming are a big part of the process that makes that possible, okay? So in 1950, Turing asked us to consider the question, can machines think? Well, Dyson says machines will dream first. If you look at what's happening today, in my book I point out that in 2006, Google bought YouTube for $1.6 billion. What did that do for Google? It gave them access to a vast amount of video data, which means that their machines could start to dream in color. They're not just working on text anymore. They're working on moving images of the physical world. So let's flip this around and ask the question, well, you know, maybe if we're creating digital artificial intelligences, maybe those really are just replicating human intelligence, because maybe human intelligence itself is digital. Okay? Here's a picture of HAL, the computer in the 1968 movie 2001 Odyssey. And I want to read you a little quote from Arthur C. Clarke's book called Space Odyssey. There's an interesting story about this movie, by the way, because the movie was actually made before the book. Usually it happens the other way around. But Clarke and Kubrick collaborated on the movie, and Clarke then went and wrote it down in the book. But anyway, in the book, he says, and eventually even the brain might go. As a seat of consciousness, it was not essential. The development of electronic intelligence had proved that. The conflict between mind and machine might be resolved at last in the internal truth of complete symbiosis. But was this to be the end? A few mystically inclined biologists went still further. They speculated that the mind would eventually free itself from matter. So this is 1968. Arthur C. Clarke was already predicting what people are now calling the singularity. He was predicting this speculative idea that we should be able to upload our consciousnesses into computers and become immortal. That's only going to be possible if our consciousness is in fact digital. In my book, I confront that question, and in fact I confront an even broader hypothesis that many physicists have, which is everything digital? Many physicists today believe that this cup is digital computational information processing. Not is like digital information processing, not can be simulated by, but is. Okay? This is a hypothesis that people call digital physics. There's a few variants of it. One of the simplest ones is that the number of possible states of a physical system is finite. And physicists have very compelling arguments that this might be the case. Their arguments, however, are flawed, and I expose those flaws in my book. And one of the key flaws is that as a hypothesis, in fact, that thesis is not falsifiable. It cannot be falsified by experiment. And you'll have to read my book to get that argument. And it's one of the few places in my book where there is some math, but it's not a lot of math. And I really do spend some effort in this book looking at this question of what really is going on in computers compared to what's going on in the physical world and in biology. And how close are these as processes? Because I think if we want to understand whether cognition is digital, we're going to need to understand the relationship between the processes that are going on in computers versus the processes going on in biological systems. And a few of the characters that show up in this analysis are Claude Shannon, Alan Turing, and Kurt Gödel, as you can probably well imagine. But one of the consequences is if cognition is not digital and is not an algorithmic process, then your mind is entirely your own. You will never be able to upload it to any machine. You will not become immortal. I'm sorry to say that. Unless cognition is digital, this cannot be done. So we would have to determine first whether cognition is digital before we can determine whether this is possible. And I show you in my book that the hypothesis that cognition is digital is not falsifiable by experiment, which means it will never be a scientific thesis. Here's a few of the other characters that come up in the book during that story: Pierre-Simon Laplace, Stephen Hawking, Thomas Bayes. That is actually not a picture of Thomas Bayes, but everyone uses it as a picture of Thomas Bayes because no one has ever been able to find a picture of him, and it looks like someone who could plausibly have been Thomas Bayes. So, okay, so back to this question of artificial intelligence. Why do we seek human imitative artificial intelligence? Is that really what we want? If we want our cars to be intelligent and imitate humans, they will do this. Come on, that car should be ashamed of itself. We don't want that. We want them to do better than humans. We want them to do things humans can't do. In my book, I say, I really don't want to have to argue with my car about getting to school on time. It's hard enough to have that argument with my daughter. Human imitative artificial intelligence is not and should not be the goal, at least from the engineering perspective. From a scientific perspective, if your goal is to understand better human intelligence, okay, make it a science experiment and acknowledge that you're doing science, not engineering. So the bottom line message is maybe we should focus more on engineering and less on science in AI. Thank you very much.
I have one.
Okay.
What we are doing here at the Embedded Systems department, we are trying to make a safety critical system. So we are trying to contain the damage that the system can do itself.
You try
Yeah, we are trying to contain the damage that the system is doing. So if you translate to the artificial intelligence, I know many people are talking about not only developing the AI, but also thinking about how can we kind of limit it somehow, not to harm with humanity. And I understand rightly from your book, you are telling somehow that we should try to align our goals together with the AI instead of containing it because we don't really understand it. Could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So when we think about designing systems that could harm humans, okay, if they do begin harming humans, we humans will almost certainly consider that to be a pathology, okay? And we will try to eradicate that harm. And as a consequence, we will be functioning as an immune system against that pathology. And if you want, so technologies that are more likely to survive are going to be the ones where the humans are not trying to attack and kill that technology because it's harming us. So this is the symbiosis story that I make, is that, you know, the more likely survivors in this Darwinian evolution are going to be the ones that cooperate rather than the ones that compete. But that's a dangerous story, right? I mean, it has certainly happened in biology where symbiotic species do co-evolve and live happily ever after. But it's also happened where species eradicate other species. Humans are particularly bad at doing this to other species on the planet, okay? And so if a strong asymmetry develops in our relationship with technology, there is real risk of that kind of situation where the machines might start to see the humans as pathologies and try to eradicate us.